Matthew 13, 1 through 9. That day Jesus went out of the house and was sitting by the sea, and large crowds gathered to him. So he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd was standing on the beach. And he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, the sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some of the seeds fell beside the road. The birds came and ate them up. Others fell on the rocky places, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, because they had no depth of soil. But when the sun had risen, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. Others fell among the thorns, and the thorns came up and choked them out. And others fell on good soil and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears, let him hear.
In late August, Robert and Sandra Harris headed back to their home some 20 miles away to Pascagoula, Mississippi. And when they came up toward their house, there was a law enforcement officer, and he said, Robert, your house is the only one left standing. Hurricane Katrina had utterly destroyed every other single home in the entire neighborhood. And as this couple made their way to their house, in this horrific sight, they could see that each side of the road was lined with nothing but slabs, with bits of debris laid out upon each one of them. Yet their house alone had withstood the gusts, the rising sea, and the flying debris. Why? Well, it wasn't sheer luck. You see, sometime in the 70s and 80s, this couple had lived near the ocean before, and each time storms had blown in, their house had blown away also. So they decided in 1999 that they were going to rebuild their house, and they were going to just do way more than all the building codes said that they should do. They went way beyond what you're supposed to do. They did everything they could afford, basically, to make sure that when the next storm came through, they wouldn't lose their home. At least the best chance that they could after it. You never know if one house is going to run into another. But still, they gave it the best shot they could, and it paid off. So, just after this, you look around at this kind of thing and you go, man, what made those people able to withstand it? So engineers start showing up, and you have these different academics even start showing up and say, what did they do? Because they did a lot of it themselves. What exactly did they do to make sure their house stood up to the test of the storms? Why it didn't fly to pieces? And you've seen these kind of amazing situations before, right? I went to see the Gerald right after the Gerald tornado, and it was the same thing. I mean, there was nothing left on the ground, but this one home was sitting there. Now, it wasn't because they had built it amazingly. It was a small, single-wide home sitting there by itself in the middle of nothing. We don't know why everything happens, but sometimes you could say, you know what? Why did this happen? And there's good reasons for it. Why did it survive an earthquake? Why did this house survive a fire? There's one that happened in Hawaii just this last week. One home sitting there in the midst of this burned up neighborhood. When the earth shakes, when the wind blows, we all get to see what our life is built upon. In 2020, during the COVID era, it doesn't matter, it struck, and all the devastation and policies or whoever you want to blame, it struck everyone. It affected everyone. And you'd look around and you would notice that some people are dealing with it much better than others. Some people were struggling with maybe the power aspects of it, maybe the health aspects of it. Some of it's helpable, some of it's not helpable. But you knew that you were, how well you might stand up to different aspects of it health-wise, right? But emotionally. We saw people just falling apart emotionally, having such a tough time. And you couldn't help but ask, why are some people able to handle this really difficult time better? Are they just stronger? Are they richer? Do they just have a better attitude? You know, things like death, disease, and financial fallout, they're going to affect everyone at some point. Whether it's en masse or just in your own time. There's always another storm coming in your life. Are you ready for it? Will you be the one standing there saying, yeah, I endured the storm. It hurt, had damages, but I made it through. I want a life that doesn't get shake to the ground when the world tries to shake me up. I know we all do. I want a church that doesn't get shaken when the world starts to shake around us. And the disciples in Matthew, in this section that we're going to cover, learn how to stand firm and faithful when mountains fall and the seas roar. How do we build a life full of life? Fruitful, with strong and deep roots. And this morning we're going to start that process of talking about building a life or living in the life of Christ, which is firm and stable. Jesus tells the crowd, he starts this with what we call the parable of the sower, which Amber read just a moment ago. The parable of the sower. I don't need to reread it. It's a very long section. She just read the first section. There's another section where he explains parables, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then he interprets this parable for us in a later section. So now that we've read this section, I just want to take a look around at the scenery, right? Matthew paints this scene. It's called the parable of the sower. It's such a nice little small story. And Jesus is sitting there in a boat, because at that time teachers, it would be reversed. I'd be sitting and you'd all be standing in the ancient world. So he's probably just sitting there in a boat, teaching there, and facing what's probably a rising hill, coming off the sea up to a rising hill that we don't know exactly where it is. There's traditions, but it could even create a nice, there's several sections there where it creates a nice amphitheater effect where a large crowd could gather. Now let's take a thought about this crowd. Let's think about this crowd. So if you go back to Matthew 12, you'll see that a lot of people around Jesus don't like him right here. So you have some of the Pharisees that are part of this crowd and group that are following Jesus around, and they're harassing him about everything, about the Sabbath, about all these things in Matthew 12. Those are people there going, you know what? You're not saying nearly enough about how much I hate Rome, about how much we're going to have to purify all of ourselves for all this stuff. That's what they want to hear. And then you got this other part of the crowd, and they know they're looking for miracles, right? They've got their problems, they've got their own kingdoms they want to build. They got stuff that they got going on, and they're hoping for money, miracles, or more. And that's essentially what you have. And all these people gather around and they're listening to Jesus, and Jesus says, a farmer went out to sow. Now, that's not exactly what they came to hear. You can imagine from the very beginning, a whole nice little story about a farmer. They don't get the interpretation. You have to remember, they don't get the interpretation. They don't get the whole point of telling a parable. They hear this story. They're hoping for these big things or mega stuff in their life, and Jesus tells this little story. Now, people knew about stories called parables. In the Hebrew, they called them mashal. Mashal. It's a wisdom saying. It's a way of telling a story to reveal a truth. And they know that there's a point in there somewhere, probably. But what they'll likely do, and if the best and the smartest and the brightest of many of these folk are going to go, and they're going to go back to their homes and think, how does that parable bring me freedom from the Romans? What's the key to this parable that will get me a miracle? That will make me money? What's the key to this parable? Oh, it must be this, it must be that, and they'll go out and do it. They're looking for how Jesus' words will enrich their kingdom. We do that all the time. I do it when I'm listening to I listen to sermons too. So you're listening to sermons, you're reading a book, you're doing these things. You say, how does this particular sermon talking about my life, my problem right now, as though that's what the whole thing is about? And Jesus is going to say, that's not what the whole thing here is about. In fact, if you're thinking that way, you're probably going to miss what the preacher, he being Jesus, is saying. Because you're looking for something that fits into this tiny little gap of your need at the moment, and you're not listening for the big picture of what the Jesus is actually talking about. See, parables are often more than an illustration of a point. They attack how we think God works. And it forces a conversion of the mind and the heart. They're not just an illustration. See, if a parable fails to shake you up and form you again, then the world's going to shake you down. In other words, Jesus' words and his teaching in the gospel should shake you up, not give you a sense of satisfaction. Satisfaction comes later. Once you're shaken up and he transforms you and brings you wholeness, then you have that. But if it's not shaking you up at some point in your life, then the world, when it shakes, you're going to get shaken because you didn't endure that gospel in your life and let it grow in you. He closes with the phrase on that text that she read, it could be he or she, he who has ears, let him hear. If that phrase doesn't smack you in the face, then you're asleep. What Jesus says when he says this, what he's saying is, you heard the story, but I'm pretty sure you didn't hear the story. That's what he's saying to all of us. It's not saying it to me. I'm not just saying it to you. When I see that, I go, man, I better go back and read what he just said again, because it's like him saying, this is a key. This is a main point, and it's much deeper than what maybe you took it as for the first reading. So, after the sermon, the disciples take Jesus aside and they say, why? So I'm kind of going. So if you're in the text, you can keep following like in 10, 11, 12, 13, all the way through 17. There's this little section. And they come to Jesus and say, why are you speaking only in parables? And Jesus, his answer here is the kind of answer that should keep you up at night. It's the kind of thing that keeps you up at night if you read it well. I mean, if you're like, going, I really need to stay awake tonight. Throw this saying of Jesus into your mind, and you might just never need to sleep for hours on end trying to figure out what he's talking about here and why he would say it, because it bothers people, bothers you at first when you read it. I'm going to kind of paraphrase his response from Isaiah 6. So you won't understand. So they won't understand. I'm talking in parables so they can't hear. You're like, wait a second, that's not how Jesus works. Why would Jesus say this? They might repent and turn and follow him, and then they won't have to endure judgment. What? That doesn't make any sense. See, this means the parable has two, we have to look at this and say, now the parable has two functions for Jesus. The first one's fairly simple. The first function of this parable is simply descriptive. It describes what's going on in the book. It describes what's going on in Jesus' ministry. He's going out and he's telling the word. He's spreading the kingdom is coming word. And there's people who respond in four different ways, four major categories of response. And you see these groups. You can see those, especially in Mark. This is told in Mark. It's almost explicit. The crowd is this group. The Pharisees are this group. The disciples are the good soil. You see how this works? And it's a descriptive of what's going on and saying, hey, I'm sowing the seed everywhere. Everybody's hearing and everybody's responding differently. That's one way. That's the descriptive way that this parable functions. Secondly, this parable functions like a filtration system. It filters out. It actually works in a way that it filters out those who are the bad soils. If you hear the bad soil, if you're bad soil and you hear this parable, you're going to walk away saying, I don't need Jesus. That's a strange thing for this to do, right? So the response to the parable determines if they're good soil or not soil. So your response to Jesus, and this is not just this parable, but the response to Jesus is their judgment. How you respond to Jesus in general, whether you accept him or deny him, is the judgment. In other words, we'll get into this. Another way to put it is hard hearts can't hear the parable about hard hearts. You have to look at this Isaiah quotation carefully to understand. Now, we don't go reading Isaiah all that often, but we do at Christmas, and that's going to help us understand this just a little bit. So God calls Isaiah in chapter 6, and Isaiah famously says, "Here am I, send me." Real quick paraphrase of that section. And then God tells Isaiah strange things. Like he doesn't say, "Go tell everybody how great I am." He goes and says, "What I want you to do is I want you to harden Israel's heart. I want you to harden their heart. I want to make them where they basically hate me." They're in love. Why? Because right now they are in love with their own ideas of who God is. They are in love with their politics. They're in love with their religion. They're not in love with me. I want a clear dividing line between who I am and the idols that they love. That's what he calls Isaiah to do. And God tells Isaiah to give them the truth about God in such a dose that they will reject God and harden their hearts completely. Why? This is where it gets weird for us, right? This isn't how we normally think. So that they can endure real judgment. He wants real judgment for Israel. Why? So that they can also experience real redemption. Real salvation out of that. Not this quaky, did I earn it or did somebody else earn it? He wants a clear definition. By condemning them, he can also be the one who saves them. Does that make sense? Now we can kind of see why Jesus is saying and quoting Isaiah here. But in other words, I'll put it this way. God says, if that's how you want it, that's how I'll give it to you. If you want to run away and do your own thing and build your own kingdom, I'll let you do that. In fact, you do that and it'll crumble and it'll fall to the point that you'll see and know that you all the time needed me. Go for it, he says. God says go for it, basically, to Israel and Isaiah. But I'm not blessing it. I will judge it, God says, because I'm not going to stop being a just judge. You go do you, but I'm not going to stop being me. I will be a just judge, and I will be a redeemer. It's a totally bogus idea that God is up in heaven desperately hoping that someone will take their brains out of their bums and believe in Jesus. He's not doing that. He loves us. But he isn't in heaven adapting and adopting all his ideas and the way he does everything so we'll feel better. He doesn't change good and evil and adapt and adopt himself so that he can be palatable to us. He's not doing that. That's not who he is. He says, look, if that's the path you want to go, you go down it and judgment's at the end of it because I'm still who I am. And I want you to go down, I want these people to go down that road, and I want them to go down it all the way till they meet judgment. Why? Because also he's at the end of that road with a cross. And he knows that's actually the only way that real salvation is going to happen for Israel. What Isaiah says that really hardens people's hearts is that God will utterly judge them for it. They never could palate this concept. Not much, we think it's like, that's a new thing. Nobody liked that even going away. They wanted God to judge the Romans, wanted God to judge their enemies, wanted God to judge all these other people. They wanted, just like us, a God who gives them what they need and demands nothing. And Isaiah says God will judge like a clearing. This is the terminology he starts to use. It'll help you connect it to this parable. God will judge Israel like clearing a forest or clearing out a vineyard. It'll just be all wiped out. All that will be left down to a single stump or a single tree. And that tree, that small thing, will be judged and it will be cut down to a stump as well. But then he says, Isaiah says, and this is where it gets familiar for you, because Jesus has been teaching his whole life that he is actually that tree. He's that one remnant of Israel that's left, and it'll be cut down. If you keep going in Isaiah, you'll see that this stump becomes what Isaiah calls a seed. And this seed becomes a tender shoot of the tribe of Judah, of the kingship of David. And this little shoot, Jesus says, is the last hope. It's the remnant of Israel. It redefines what Israel is. It comes from Israel, but also redefines. All the hope is in that one little tender shoot. And that one little tender shoot is Jesus Christ our Lord. He knows He's the last hope. All the other things that you could put your hope in are hopeless. We read this at Christmas as part of this core story of Jesus' identity, but it forces the question for them that they don't like. Here's the last part that they don't like this question, is that who is the real Israel? Because if it comes down to the Messiah, if it comes down to just Jesus, then He redefines, not changes and not replaces, redefines Israel. He is the one seed out of which all of Israel will now come out. And the only way to be a part of that is not by some new ethnicity, it is by faith in Him. And that's the hope of all Israel. And it becomes, in Paul, the hope of all the world. That we become part of this seed, this hope. And so as he's talking about spreading seed, the sower who's spreading the seed, he's spreading this word about himself, saying, this is the place of hope. This is it. It's got to go deep down into you and start changing the very core of your identity, changing the very core of what it means to be God's people, at least in their minds. It never really changed what it meant to be God's people, but it had to transform their hearts and minds from this idea that it's just a geographical place with a promise to someday rule the world over all the Gentiles. It changes their whole mindset to what God's initial vision really was. He says, and you say, wait, this is getting complicated. From just a tiny little small story. I think that's the reason Jesus said, those who have ears, let them hear. He's packing a lot into these parables. He's packing a deep set, life transitioning mold into this. This parable of the sower is a huge changing or a marker in Matthew and in Mark that says Jesus is doing something else. He's calling the people, the true followers, out from the crowd. And He's going to build these disciples up as He's making His way to the cross. And the question is, can you make it to the cross? See, He's declaring here that He's not a way to God among other ways. He's the one seed. He's the one pathway. I think more than all else, He's saying you can't treat Him like an experiment of religious ideas. He's not some ideological or cosmic power to sprinkle on your dreams to get what you want. In fact, the moment you think that way, that other things can pull you away, that the thorns and the stones and all of these things are in the way. That means you're just kind of sprinkling Jesus in with everything else. You're sprinkling Jesus in on the top. You're making Him the frosting of life, hoping things will be good. The moment you do that, you won't understand it. You won't understand who Jesus is. By just thinking that way, you're already demonstrating you don't get what Jesus is. That's what Jesus is saying. Your religious experiment will fail. Alistair Begg, a famous pastor, I love how he said it. He said, you'll see where the marks are, where his quote is, but you cannot get to the truth, or you can't come to grips with the truth and a relationship and the hope of Jesus from the safe distance of a detached curiosity. That's how we do things. I'm going to do a scientific experiment to see if God works. That's what science is, a detached curiosity. I'm going to keep my distance, be objective, try Jesus out for a little while. He says you can't come to grips with the gospel from a safe distance of a detached curiosity. I'm going to go see what this Jesus has to offer me. That's a detached curiosity. Imagine for a second these disciples bringing their friends to Jesus. This is something. Imagine they start bringing, these disciples are like, they're on fire for Jesus, right? And they start bringing their friends and their old friends. Simon the Zealot shows up, and he brings his political activist friends, and they're hoping to hear about this Messiah, this great Messiah. Speak about this amazing new kingdom. They think, wow, he's really going to tell this old world and those old Romans the truth. He's going to start smiting my enemies. He's going to start smashing my political foes. He's going to be on every hot topic policy I've ever wanted. He's going to be my kind of guy, you know? But then Jesus floats out there sitting on a boat, and he says, there was a farmer who sowed a seed. Who's this? I ain't got time for this. I wanted something hot. I wanted something that really got my fire going, you know? Made me upset with just, he doesn't share my madness at this world. And then the tax collector Levi shows up with his buddies, and they're sitting around the crowd, and man, they're like, this guy can make bread, like 5,000 loaves of bread out of just a couple. He can make wine. Do you know the profitability on that kind of thing? Man, I bet he might even know the next big stock market move. The next place that maybe we should invest our money so we can build an army and a kingdom. Man, he could supply an entire army, an entire kingdom with nothing but his words. Man, I could get rich off this. I bet I could leverage this somehow. Wonder where I can get my next tax advice at, you know? And he's sitting there, and Jesus says, there was a farmer who sowed a seed, and 3/4 of them didn't even come up. Well, that's pretty pointless. Yeah, there's 30, 60, and 80, but look how wasteful that was. I ain't got time for that. And the disciples come right after this, and they say, Jesus, I gave you a chance to convert my friends, and you tell them these strange stories. What were you thinking? And Jesus essentially says, they didn't come for my kingdom. They came to enhance theirs. So they can hear nothing at all. So if the gospel is shrouded in mystery and over-promises or not meeting your expectations, you have misplaced expectations. And you'll never really hear the gospel. You might walk up and accept Jesus as an experiment to see if you get what you want, and you'll wonder, well, I'm not supposed to have cancer. I'm not supposed to have this. I'm supposed to have an easier life when I accept Jesus. You didn't listen. You didn't show up. You didn't hear what Jesus is actually saying, because he says the thorns will think, the rocky paths will go, you know what? I've had some suffering. I've had some persecution, some hard times. I'm gone. I'll see you later. If you're bathed in a God who fixes your little kingdom, you may never encounter the true God. If you're still wondering, I don't know what this God is about. I come and I hear, but I don't hear. I don't get nothing out of it. If you say, I don't get nothing out of it, it's probably because you showed up to get something out of it. And I don't mean that in the best way. You can get something out of it in a good way too. But you get what I mean. This parable says we wouldn't hear it if Jesus himself spoke it. It was the pastor. Now, we want to be as clear as we can as pastors and preachers. But even if Jesus himself speaks it, apparently, we wouldn't hear it. So where does the responsibility for understanding lie? Is it on the sower? It's not on the sower. It isn't about the size of my brain or anybody else's brain or some famous preacher on TV's brain. It isn't the passion of our heart. It's not the expanse of my academic background. It's not about his fame or her fame. It doesn't matter if the sower is the Son of God himself. Let's read the interpretation quickly. 19 through 22. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one on whom the seed was sown beside the road. The one whom the seed was sown on the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when, affliction or persecution arises because of the word, which I mentioned just a minute ago, immediately he falls away. And the one on whom the seed was sown among the thorns, this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of the wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. Let's talk about each one of these briefly. I could probably do a sermon on each one of these in particular, but it's a fairly simple illustration, very simple interpretation in a sense. There's the first one, sown on the path. There is no penetration of the seed at all into the soil, the heart. It's just totally turned off. It says, I don't care to have anything to do with this guy Jesus. Some people we know, they just don't care to think about it. They don't want to have anything to do with it. Jesus is important. Maybe he isn't real. And they might show up even to church once or twice, but they really don't need or want what Jesus is offering. And I got to say, sometimes they're actually understanding it a little more clearly than everyone else. They get it and they don't want it. It's just not there. Rocky places. In the rocky places, there's a person who gets, this is the person who gets, and we all have seen this, you accept Jesus, they come to the front, or they sort of accept Jesus, they come to the front, they get baptized, they're on fire, they're getting what they want from Jesus, and maybe that's just passion or a sense of freedom or forgiveness, but at the first taste of suffering, at the first taste of difficulty, or things not going how they should be going in their mind, it's just too much. God's giving too little. They're giving too much. God's giving too little. They're out. Then there are the thorns. And the thorn bushes are where I think most church folks struggle most of the time. I think most people I know have had to at least try to make their way through the thorns. And even if they make it to good soil, there's a thorny time in their life, right? This is where the cares of the world get in the way. Priority of other life aims choke out God out of their life. God at a distance is good enough. That's just where, it's a religiosity idea. I kind of do these little things and take care of it and such. But really all the other priorities of life seem much more important. We tell ourselves, well, he's not a God who would demand so much. He's so good, right? And for us in our world right now, being good means not demanding much. Well, then we can go all kinds of different places. We'll tell ourselves, well, it's just practice. It's just family. It's just some other thing that keeps me from doing my prayer time, from attending a local mission or church. And my personal favorite logical workaround for this. Now, this is my when I'm in the thorns, my favorite workaround, my thought process to get God's approval this way to do it all the time would be legalistic. I don't want to be legalistic about stuff. If I tell everybody, well, I've got to do this and I've got to do this and I got to do that, or I want to do this and I really feel like I need to be at this thing all the time, and I tell, well, you know what? I don't really want to be legalistic. That's my logical workaround for this, to be in the thorns and say God approves. I don't know if maybe you don't have one. I don't know, but that's mine. I've had to struggle with it, and it actually reveals in my own heart what it means to have a relationship with God. In other words, I try to pretend it's I turn it into this legal thing. I don't want it to be a legal thing, and so then I don't have the relationship. Well, he who has ears, let him hear. I won't say more. Jesus' point is that people hear, but they don't follow. They don't allow it to penetrate anything but their most superficial problems, their dreams of immortality, or their current storm. And Jesus says the roots of the gospel can't go deep if you make God about you. It is extremely personal, your relationship with God. It's for each of you, one by one, to seek God for who He is and accept Jesus for yourself. I read this and I feel Jesus's, what must have been Jesus's feeling and God's feeling in some way. I felt this. I can't create desire in a listener. I gave up on that years ago. I can't create desire for God in my children, in my wife, for anybody else. I'm not the person who can decide for them that they want God. I can share with them the Word. I can share with people the Word. I can't make them want it. That's the Holy Spirit's job. And that's our job, to say, you know what? I'm not wanting God enough in my life. I know that I should. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to discipline myself to do some things that will, like when you have to rebuild a relationship with a spouse or something. You have to spend time with them. When you're angry with them and you've separated from somebody, you've got to go back and intentionally spend time with them that maybe you really wish you were somewhere else for that moment. But you really know that if you spend time with them, that if you invest in them emotionally and you love and care for them, that will come. You got to do that. See, let's put it this way. I want each of you to withstand the storm of life. I want each of you to be there as the gales and the next gales come up over you. But the sower can't do it. It's only the soil and the seed. Hebrews 12:28. You can look it up later if you want, but I'll just mention it. It says that we receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken. That's what it says. We can receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken. The world's going to basically end even at some point, but it's going to stand. All things are going to stand. So the point is not, this is where the metaphors fall short. It's not that God is making just personally you unshakable. You are in Him who is unshakable. You're in it's His kingdom which is not shaken. And when you're in His kingdom, when you let His kingdom grow in you, that's the unshakableness of a person. It's not just making you personally strong or you personally capable. It's you letting God be capable and strong in you. And I say this, we have to adapt, adopt, and let God animate us. While maybe you accept Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, your fruit will show what is true. There's a lot of people who walk to the front. I baptized a lot of people I never see again, except for doing things that are destructive for their lives. I'm not judging them. They're destroying their lives. It's quite obvious. And that's not me judging them. I don't have to judge them for that. They're destroying themselves. Their judgment is themselves. And I'm not saying they're not going to heaven, but I'm saying the fruit. Jesus says there's fruit. How do you have fruit? You adapt, you adopt, you adopt, and you animate. Adapt to your landscape. Now, I've seen people prepare. Have you ever seen people prepare a field for maybe the very first time to be ready for planting? I've seen a place where I grew up where basically it was full of thorns and mesquites and pathways and roads and all kinds of stuff out in this pasture. And first of all, you got to go and you got to tear out the big stuff and the little stuff. You just got to take it all out. You got to knock down the trees. You got to do all these things. You got to tear out the thorns. We use bulldozers now, right? But back in the day, this was a lot of work. It was a lot of work to get the crud out of your field. And you'd go and you'd cut down all these trees. You'd clear out all of this stuff and burn it usually. But then, if this was a rocky area, like I was in Georgetown and worked construction there, you would dig literally like 3 inches into dirt and you would hit solid rock, right? This is not normally a good place to plant stuff, but when you're in Israel or you're in other places, you get this lot of land, you got to do what you got to work with. In life, you get what you got to work with in life. And so they would bust up rock. And you'd bust up this rock, and you'd actually have to hire people in the ancient world to come through and pull out all the big rocks so it didn't mess up your equipment and so that you could plant. So you got to tear out the rocks, you got to tear out the thorns, you got to tear all of these things out. You've got to adapt your landscape. In other words, you have to figure out what in your life is keeping you from growing. What are the things, what are the major areas in life that you're going to have to read your Bible, you're going to have to get community help, you're going to have other people maybe walk with you and say, what are these trees and these rocks in my life that I need to be pulled out to grow? Are you willing to do that work? This is work. Jesus is saying is on you. It's a responsibility. The Holy Spirit will help you. He'll guide you. He'll show you what these are through community. He'll show you are through His text. But you've got to put some work in to getting these things out of your life to grow. Now, that's real tedious work. And we got a lot of people who go, you know what, I kind of like that tree. Those are the people I'm too bitter to forgive. Those are the tragedies I can't let go of. But then you've got to adopt the good things of God so that God's life goes deep. So you've adapted your landscape. Then you have to adopt. In other words, you've got to pick a new seed. You've got to decide, I want the healthy thing. I want the good things in my life. What is the point? What does Jesus say should happen? He says that you need to go deep. Well, today, I guess one of the ways we might say that is it should forge an identity that you are Jesus's. You forge an identity. In other words, we're not forging some alternative weird identity that I know changing our identity is this weird thing now. It means saying that I am Jesus's and I'm not mine anymore. And that changes who you are. You can't say this without knowing that you're going to take up a cross and that you're going to suffer. It changes your mindset. Jesus is, and here we have to learn. This is the biggest, I think the most difficult thing for me to learn as coming and maturing, that Jesus is exceptional, but He's not an exception. He's exceptional. He's the perfect, ultimate one, but He's not an exception. He isn't the one who came to do it right so we can keep doing it wrong. He didn't come and say, I'm going to forgive you so you can keep living how you want to. Or I'm going to come and suffer so you don't have to suffer. He doesn't suffer so we don't have to suffer. He dies so that we don't have to eternally die. But He doesn't suffer because we don't have to suffer. In fact, He says, those who think that when they meet suffering and they think, wow, I shouldn't have any of that, they walk away. He's exceptional, but He's not the exception. In fact, He is the one we are to emulate and imitate, not think of as the exception. And that will allow God to animate your life. God makes things grow, and He will show you what's good for you. This is asking God to make desires in your life grow. I've mentioned this just a moment ago, but I'll be quick with it. I try to get my son to like certain foods because I know that they're really good for him and they're healthy. Now, I tell him, if you keep eating these things, you'll start to like them. Because there's people who like menudo. Some of you. Yeah. I'm sorry I couldn't swallow that one myself. But there are, mushrooms. There are all kinds of different things when you eat them regularly. There's people around the world, they eat some crazy stuff. But they've eaten them since they were young. They've eaten them over time. And if you take those things away from them, all of a sudden they crave it. And you're like, that's disgusting. Why in the world would you want that, right? But I tell my son, I tell my kids, you keep eating this, and at some point, you're going to like it. And it's healthy, right? This is what you need. And at some point, through all the grossness and all these things that kids go through and we go through, you'll start to love what's good for you. And that's what I'm saying. When you have to discipline your heart for prayer, you have to discipline your heart for these different areas that help you grow. And at some point, you'll go, man, I really miss my prayer time today. Man, I'm not stable right now. And that moment that you know you're not stable, you know you're anxious, and I know this firsthand right now, when I miss my prayer times and thought times and I'm going through what I'm going through, my anxiety goes through the roof, and I say, I'm not stable. Why? Because I haven't put myself in Jesus, who is the stable one. I'm never going to be the stable one on my own. I need what's good for me. And you have to disconnect. First of all, you got to disconnect from that worldliness. I will say that. You got to connect to the kingdom. Disconnect from the worldliness and connect to the kingdom. And as you do this, as you connect to the kingdom, what's going to happen is, the metaphors don't always work great, but as you connect to the kingdom, you'll find yourself disconnecting to the world. Sometimes it's not do one and then the other. Sometimes it's just connect to Jesus and let him start pulling up the trees. That's why I say the metaphors don't always work. But there was a huge earthquake struck Japan not too long ago, and a journalist was working in this high-rise skyscraper and thought, wow, that was a little shaky, that was a little uneasy, that was something, it was an interesting day. And he goes down and travels down at the end of the day, and he starts looking around, and almost every building is toppled. He can't believe it. It was like the 7.8 earthquake. It was this huge earthquake. And he was like, what in the world? How come I didn't feel that? How did I get through it so easy? And so he began to look back and say the engineers learned to build these giant rubber isolators. It should pull up. There's this incredible isolator. It's rubber. It has this thing. And when the earth shakes, the building doesn't move because the earth shakes and it stays still. So you get this going on. And how this works. So yes, it's loosely connected. The more disconnected it is when the world shakes, the less he shakes. And Jesus is essentially going to be telling us the same thing. The more that we are loosely connected, we're not disconnecting from the world in some ways. In fact, we're supposed to be going to the world, but disconnected from worldliness, then the less we will get shaken up when our world shakes around us. Because the building would stand for the kingdom. The building is its own thing. When that earth shakes, we're not going to get shaken. The more you seek riches and power and all the way the world seeks stability, because what would be your first thought, right? Dig deep, right? If I want to be stable, what do? I dig deep. I dig rods, and that's true for the hurricane. This is where metaphors fail. But for an earthquake, you don't dig deep. You barely connect to the world. And here's the same thing. If you're seeking riches and power, you're digging deep into the world. And when it shakes, you're going to shake. When Wall Street fails, you're going to shake. I think the point's fairly clear. When your political theories or your political people get messed up or shaken, you're going to get shaken. Attach to the unshakable kingdom. What is it in your life that you need to do? Do you need to right now say, I need to attach to Jesus? I need to spend some time in prayer. I want to work on God animating my life so that his desires are my desires, that his wants become my wants. Do you need to add prayer time to your life? What is it right now that God is saying, I want you to do this with me because I want good soil. I want to be growing in good soil. What do you need to have good soil in your life? Ask God that we're going to worship here in just a moment. And I want you to commit something to God. Say, I want to every day do this, or every week be doing and active in making sure that I am more connected with God than I am to the world.